Yo, what's up guys? Today we'll be talking about the absurdity of the fall. If you've ever studied Christian doctrine, there's so many ideas regarding the fall.
And then you have the first man made by Alpha.
That's how we got original sin. That's how we're held accountable. There's so many ideas that when pushed back far enough, go back to Adam and Eve. But in that story, the assumption is always that the devil is bad and that God is good. That the knowledge of good and evil was bad, whatever that could mean, and the idea that the world was perfect before it. Today we'll be talking about all of that and more as I go through the fall in an absurdist philosophy. We'll be going over many ideas, but first we'll start with an absurdist philosophy. We'll be talking about the framework on which we'll view this story from. We won't be viewing it from a Christian perspective as that's been done ad nauseam. Secondly, we'll be going over the fall of humans and ignorance. We'll talk about what this means, and I'm so excited for this point. Then we'll go over the value of the fall, why it mattered, what was being done from this philosophy perspective. And then finally, we'll be going over human purpose and divine perspective. The ideas of God. How did God view this? What does this mean? And then I'll completely finish by just appreciating the story. This story is beautiful and shows so many observed ideas in this reality. So if you're ready to get deep into this idea, then I'm ready too. Let's get started. Many people, when I talk about an absurdist philosophy, immediately jump to the ideas of the traditional absurdist worldview. This is completely coherent and makes a lot of sense. But today we won't be doing that. Instead, we'll be going over what I viewed about life and how I think it's absurd, not in the logical contradiction way, but in the ways that touch the soul, the ways that we know are intuitively true. Firstly, I want to just define what makes life absurd in my view. Lots of people say that life is logically absurd. They'd say that the basis of reality is absurd itself, or that the perspective on which we view the basis of reality is absurd. They might point to someone who lives their life. He cares about things. He loves things. He goes through many suffers, yet at the end of his life, he realizes it's meaningless. What was the point of all that work? What was the point of all that endurance? They would say there is no point at all. And that's the absurdity, that man tries to find meaning in a world that is just not made for that. Life can't provide man with meaning because there is no meaning to go from. This view is very consistent and it's very logical. But recently, when I was watching the movie Joker 2019, it sparked me with an urgent sense of depravity, an existential craving for truth. And I wondered why I felt this way. At the end of the day, it's all meaningless. I shouldn't want truth. So I thought about it more, and I wrote in my journal that life is not meaningless because we suffer, but life is meaningless because we do not know why we suffer. When a lamb is clenched in between the jaw of a wolf, that is not absurd. What's absurd is the fact that the lamb does not know why it is happening. He's going through much pain and he's putting much effort and endurance to survive, but he doesn't know why. The absurdist would say, see, you're proving my point. The absurdity isn't in the knowledge of why not. It's in the absurdity that there is none, meaning no real reason. And if that's the case, then I understand, but that's why I said I want to do something a little bit different than just the traditional absurdist philosophy. Because really, there'd be no real reason to not just commit suicide at that point. Sisyphus can push the boulder up the hill, but is there any real backing for that? Well, no, it's just him conquering over the absurdity. But for no real reason. He just is. He's doing it. And with a smile. It's the apparent beauty of it all, but I want to suppose two different options. Either there is no real or objective meaning, whatever that could mean. Man has no real duty, and this life is totally absurd. Or the second, that there is possibly meaning to life, and we just don't know what it is. We can't know. We're agnostic to it. There are different perspectives to this, and I'm only using the purpose in a very vague term, but the idea is that we do not know. The lack of knowledge in life makes life feel absurd. Even with the idea that there is a meaning out there, it's absurd that we don't know what it is. We suffer too much for us to live in ignorance. That seems like the real burden. That seems like the real depravity. Not increase in knowledge, but the lack thereof. In that state of being, I can only imagine to laugh. I mean, imagine you're Joker in 2019 film. In purpose of not spoiling the movie, there's so many things that went wrong, and he really has lost everything. And yet, what does he choose to do? He chooses to laugh. Not a happy laugh, but a laugh of depravity. Like a laugh of a single parent who comes home at the end of the day after a long week of grueling hard work and has to drive their kid to a soccer game.
Why are you crying?
Of course, that's a silly example, but we all know that feeling, where you've lost so much, where you just have to laugh at the absurdity of your life. I think the quote from Joker perfectly summarizes this. He says, "I used to think that my life was a tragedy, but now I know it's a comedy." He found it amusing and illogical, all the suffering that he went through. He found it funny. He found that it meant nothing. It was illogical, or in other words, it was absurd. That is my version of absurdity. I think it keeps a more open mind, keeping the two options of either there is no meaning or that there is one that we can't know or we haven't figured out, or maybe I'm just agnostic to. There might be a real meaning that we have seen, we have noted. Maybe it's Buddhism, maybe it's Christianity, but I don't know. My perspective, I don't know it. I don't know the meaning, and I've earnestly sought it. It's absurd with all the pain that so many people go through that they might have the same results as I. I've lived a nice life. I can't complain at all. Recently, I was at church and a woman used the analogy of water. She said that God's presence is like soda. Water fountains are everywhere. Water's abundant and easy to access. But soda's hard to get, and that stuff's special. I remember finding it so absurd and careless and stupid and annoying that I tapped my friend and I said, "This makes no sense." Are you really gonna say that to the kid who is dehydrated and dying? It just shows an ignorance to other people's situation. And to the one who is ignorant yet suffers greatly, that man's life is absurd. My life is also absurd, but greatly less absurd. I know much more. I mean, imagine a man who is kicked out of his tribe and he's forced to wander the deserts. He has no one to talk to explain why he's here. What do you say to that man, if not to empathize with him and say that his life is absurd? It seems like that man's problem is not the suffering, but the ignorance. I could imagine a man who has a clear goal, yet suffers greatly. We know when we go to college that we might suffer through nights of, unending work, but we have a clear goal at the end. Or even to the person who's in the military, they have a clear goal of helping their country. They may even get close to death. They might even die, yet they knew why. It seems absurd that there'd be such a great amount of suffering, but I think further, the real absurdity is the fact that we don't know why we suffer. I think that's the problem, not the suffering, but the ignorance. Either that's true or nothing matters, and the absurdist philosophy is in some way true, and we can just stop the video here. So, now that we have our framework set out, let's talk about the fall. We've identified our philosophical framework. The enemy is absurdity, and the cause of that enemy is ignorance. So let's look back onto where Adam and Eve are. Adam and Eve were created out of dust to live on this earth, a lifestyle very close to the author's, one of farming, where they would have effort. Adam's famous job is that he would name things. He'd go around and point and say, "Hey, look, that's Groot." I'd argue with that. I'd say, "No, I am Groot."
No, I am Groot.
What the hell?
Oh my god.
Adam had a nice, pleasureful, positive life. He didn't suffer greatly, but he was lacking one thing, and that was knowledge. Although Adam's life was so perfect and so nice to live in, we can all just imagine not having to work for a wage. He still was lacking in knowledge. And I'd argue that Adam was living in a metaphorical experience machine. We all know the story. Neuroscientists have found a way to trick the brain into thinking that there are real experiences happening that aren't. They're pleasureful, they're amazing, they're full of joy even. They release so much dopamine into the brain, but not only dopamine, also serotonin. Not only that of pleasure like you find in drugs, but also that when you complete a huge project or you've just finished a workout. One of deep success, one that really makes you feel good. You're proud of yourself. They can hook you up to a machine with all those feelings, and you'll be none the wiser to know that you're hooked up to a machine. You can't escape. This is quite literally the best possible situation. Yet each of us feel as if this would be wrong because we're not in tune in our reality with truth. We're just simply experiencing things. It's an illusion. We're living in like a psychedelic river, one where you're baptized into it and you never leave. It's just so nice to feel the water rolling through your fingers. Each ripple passing, each moment, is just another countdown to your futility. And in the end, it had all been meaningless, but you'd have enjoyed it. My question is, what would it be like to experience the experience machine? And my answer is the Garden of Eden. The Garden of Eden seems like the perfect myth to show the experience machine. Period. Oh my goodness, bro. I'm in a writer's mode right now, bro. Did I really just say period? Y'all, I was thinking through the words in my head and I read out the period that I was imagining. Yo, I might be cooked, bro. This is all to show you that just because Adam and Eve lived a good life without pain and with such good pleasure and feelings of success, they lived at peace. They didn't live with meaning. Their life was the definition of absurdity. If you've ever seen a baby so happy about something that doesn't matter and you've thought, what futility, then you know what I mean. I'd imagine most normal people haven't thought that, but I think most philosophers have. But that's besides the point. The point is that Adam is living a life of futility. It doesn't matter. It's absurd. He feels good, but he's ignorant. That ignorance leads to this absurdity. He doesn't know why he lives. He doesn't have reason behind it. He's living an absurd life. Before, the absurdity was in the fact that he didn't know why he suffered. Now the absurdity is in the fact that he doesn't know why he feels pleasure. He doesn't know why things are so good. And with that lack of knowledge comes absurdity, our enemy. Now let's get into our third point, the value of the fall. We've acknowledged that Adam and Eve lived a completely absurd life, one of pleasure, of success, but it had no meaning. They were ignorant. Absurdism is our enemy and ignorance is the cause. So if Adam and Eve were to receive knowledge beyond them to better explain their reality they're placed in, life would suddenly become less absurd. Perhaps you were to explain why Yahweh God had put them on the earth. Life would immediately become less absurd. It answers so much of their ignorance. We might even label this as something of them becoming more like God. So when God withholds the knowledge of good and evil, he's keeping them ignorant. He's keeping their life absurd. And the text, if you read it without the rest of the Bible, it seems as if God is trying to keep them lower. That way they don't rule over God. The God seems to be so fearful of their power in their knowledge that he withholds the crucial information, the knowledge of good and evil. How can they fall if they know good? Immanuel Kant spoke on this. He spoke that when we do evil, it's simply out of ignorance. We don't realize the value of good. If they truly understood good in every way, they wouldn't have sinned. They would have realized the true value in it. So he withholds the information of good and evil. And in the withholding of the information, the absurdity of life grows. So when the devil comes around and gives them a way out of this absurdity, purely by their ignorance, they choose to receive it, not because they thought through this, but rather because it looked good. And when their eyes are open, I'd argue they became wiser. As the text says, they become like God. They knew good and they knew evil. And I want you to imagine what it would be like to not know good and evil, to not experience positive and negative things. It seems like the ideas of morality is what would set us apart. made by God. We know good and evil. Truly, before the fall, were these people called Adam and Eve really people? They didn't know good and evil. They only knew what was told by them from the Father. They were in total submission to God's will, having no will of their own. This seems to as well be what heaven would be like in the New Testament. And what is that, if not eternal slavery to God? A lacking of what makes us human. An eternal group of vessels, as Romans 9 says, to bring glory to God. That idea seems to strip away what makes us human, and if anything, that seems depraved. You can play it off like you're giving God what he deserves, but we all must ask the question on why God desires glory, not for the sake of his creation, but for his eternal sake. What is he lacking in? The existence of God seems absurd. It seems like you're playing in a video game, a simulation where nothing matters. God, in his eternal reality, would be the simulation. It would be totally absurd and with no way out. I want to do a full video on this, but if you kind of understand what I'm saying, you can say it with me that this seems like hell. There'd be no point, nothing to strive for, no desire. You know all things. And in that total competence, it's vanity. Again, that's a point for another day, but I want you to just imagine that picture on Adam and Eve. Would you want them to stay in that situation? Would you think that it's the best possible outcome for them? I'd argue that all of us know that an absurd life is no life at all. That Adam and Eve eating the fruit and beginning to know good and evil was the best thing that could ever happen to them. The most true elements of reality, which is morality, which Christians say is built off the objective true reality of God's character, was made known to them, and their life just suddenly became so much less absurd. What is that, if not positive? We wouldn't want our children to stay children. If a parent sheltered their children so much to the point where they were beyond ignorant, we would see that as truly evil. And it's so much worse on God's part. I mean, truly, do you think it would be fair for a parent to do that? To withhold such knowledge to the point where it ends in death? I'd argue that none of us think so. Parents should raise their person to become another little person who will raise another little person who will raise another little person. Or at least be self-sufficient. Living in ignorance is not the way to do it. It wouldn't be fair. You've been given the gift of knowledge and you don't give back. Beyond forgiveness, knowledge. We empathize and we give knowledge. We give what we have to make life less absurd. And for God, in his full knowledge, to not give to the creation which he loves seems not only like a contradiction, but also evil, if such a thing exists. I'm not logically reasoning this. This isn't the point. I'm not trying to make arguments to convince you. I'm just trying to share a perspective. I empathize to some extent with whoever watches this. So much so that I've put together this video to share with you my take on this. Not to argue that your take is wrong, but instead to show you another perspective and to help you by you growing out of your ignorance and be educated. And hopefully you help me grow out of my ignorance and me become educated. And I say this all the time, but by any means possible, we must keep thinking. And this idea of the fall helps us think about these hard ideas. It's so beautiful to see this play out. We can set up a scenario on which all life takes place and use it as a sandbox to try to explain the world around us. And I've told this to many people, but I think that's what the biblical authors were doing, and they did a damn good job of it. They explain the world around them in such beautifully poetic ways that it leads people thousands of years later into understanding. Not in the sense of the beauty being pretty or right, but in just what is written. We sit here and we appreciate it. One of my favorite things to do is to talk to people. I always go up to people and try to immediately become friends. People who know me say, oh yeah, Eli, he doesn't have a problem making friends. And that's true, but there's something very sad about making friends. It's not that you have to see them go, but it's the idea that you can't spend more time growing in understanding with them. I mean, truly, the ones who I don't want to hang out with, I really could care less. To those who have something to add to my life, or I just enjoy being with them and their unique personality, their unique takes on the world, those I deeply value. I like to think of a guy I know, his name's Chris. He struggles a lot with addiction, and a lot of people view him as a loser. A lot of people think that he's not much, but I view him as a very strong individual because he's had a very hard life and has chosen to keep living. And instead of denying it and having faith, burying your head in the sand, he accepts it. He identifies the problem and decides that he'll live with an attitude of a beginner, one who's agnostic. I'd imagine he questions why he's had to go through what he's gone through, and that's where empathy comes in. Enough empathy to bring about knowledge. I empathize with his heartache and tell him what I know. His dad does the same as they struggle together, and a Christian minister reaches to him, letting him know what they have to say. No one's in the wrong. No one's leading him astray in any way. If anything's in the wrong, it's ignorance. It's the absurdity of it all. The human life is one of suffering, and I truly do mean that, which is why I don't have a further apologetic to explain why it's not. So for everyone who's listened to this, I hope you enjoyed it. And beyond all, keep with your empathy and grow in knowledge. I want to thank you guys for being here. If you support the mission of this channel, then leave a sub. Drop a like, share me with someone who you think's really could keep an open mind. I'd love to hear what reflective knowledge you have to share. And if I haven't made it clear, the purpose of this channel is to grow in empathy for the purpose of knowledge in the form of art. And with all that being said, we enact that by staying curious.